Hey everyone, it's Tom, and it's Sunday and the day of the 50th Super Bowl. And though I generally resist doing videos that are topical in nature, I thought that I might talk a bit about the connection, or some connections which might be drawn between certain aspects of the National Football League and Marxism. I should say it might be useful at the outset to address the question, what is Marxism? And Marxism, broadly, he's going to resist an unduly brief definition. But to say a brief one, you can say that it's a movement which more or less takes its point of departure from Karl Marx, who, influenced by strands in German philosophy, certain French utopian notions, and English political economy, extracted a series of criticisms and insights that were then taken up and developed since. And among these, some which sort of are shared by most Marxists, despite lots of play for slight disagreements and emphasis and so forth, are the following. One is that the system of economy in which we find ourselves ensconced, more or less capitalism, actually conceals a set of social relationships by enacting those relationships through financial relations, fiscal relations, monetary relations. The most significant of which is probably the wage relationship, where behind the nominal freedom to trade our labor is concealed a fundamentally oppressive interaction, where the owner, exploiting, to use the classical language, their control of the means of production, can extract the effort of the laborer to generate profit. But the fact that this is an oppressive relationship, despite being intuitively evident, as most of us have felt, in having a sense about our jobs at times, that they were sources of suffering rather than emancipation. Rather than seeing this directly, is recast as an inevitable consequence of the material forces which rule our lives, quote unquote, rule our lives. This illusion was characterized by Marx as the fetish of the commodity, and is the principal means whereby class, as a category which organizes human society, is hidden, or at least obscured. And that hidden or obscured quality allows for the preservation of the iniquity which class represents. The aspiration of Marxism is to move beyond this circumstance to a society where class no longer has such power. And beyond this point, there's a whole scope of disagreement as to, what does that movement entail? I'm not going to get into that at the moment, because the idea here is to simply inflect excuse me, how the lenses which we inherit from that perspective can affect how we see the NFL. And in that connection, I'm going to bring up the Green Bay Packers, that are an exceptional team in that, as most of you probably know, is the only team in the NFL which is organized on a non-for-profit basis and which is owned on a common stock basis by the community of Green Bay, which, and by some people outside of Green Bay, but in any event, you're looking at a share of those distribution distribution of the shares, somewhere in the neighborhood of 300,000 or so people, owning somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 million shares, with the stipulation that no one person can own more than 200,000 shares, preventing undue influence from any single person. In essence, the team of Green Bay, the Green Bay Packers, is owned by the community and not by a private individual. In 1960, Roger Goodell wrote into the Constitution of the NFL the stipulation that no other team could follow suit from what was happening or is happening with the Green Bay Packers. That any team that was to become a member of the NFL could not be owned by a charity, nor could it be owned by any nonprofit organization. Moreover, on top of the fact that the teams of the NFL must be privately owned, they cannot be held, any given team cannot be owned by more than 32 people. And among those 32 people, the lead owner must have something, at least 30% share of equity. In fact, they revised the ownership rules again just this past year. So technically, the owner of the machine of a team could devolve to a trust as opposed to an individual. And the reason for this was actually to enable the consolidation of ownership within a family so that it could pass from one generation to the next. Look at this relatively outrageous arrangement whereby these teams then, which make, some of them are valued at, over $1 billion or in the neighborhood of $1 billion, and which make, ridiculous sums on a profit basis. These teams are then sort of put, are controlled in a fashion where, just this handful of individuals, no more than 32, controls this perhaps, several hundred million or billion dollar valuated entity that generates anywhere from a few million to tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars, sometimes on an annual basis. At the same time as this is happening, the facilities which broadly enable the NFL to operate the stadiums and so forth, well, who pays for them? The cities, right? Vis-a-vis taxation. I mean, there are variations in the terms of the agreements, but you could take the Cincinnati case, for example, Paul Brown Stadium, which costs somewhere in the neighborhood, depending on how you do it, between $400 to $600 million, broadly paid for by a regressive sales tax on the citizens of Hamilton County, in which Cincinnati is ensconced, right? And who benefits from that? The Cincinnati Bengals, privately owned, making tens of millions of dollars in profit, and not being a particularly good team. So, what does that have to do with Marxism? Well, when you apply a Marxist lens to these phenomena, what you see is how a disposition to organize our society along class lines leads to outrageous circumstances like this. And an attitude of profit generation encourages the construction of institutional frameworks that serve to underwrite and vouchsafe inequality. And besides for the disjunction, which is I've cited here, between how the community broadly pays for these teams, which then in turn provide ridiculous sums of money to a handful of already incredibly powerful, wealthy individuals, okay, you can look at the relationship between the ownership and the players themselves, which also follows from another aspect of the Marxian analysis, which I didn't specifically highlight before. Namely how, well, perhaps indirectly in that I alluded to the wage relationship, but what happens with the wage relationship is that the worker is reduced to the status of a commodity. The worker is, if you like, thingified. In the case of the NFL, the workers are the players. And the fact that the ownership, because of the way the NFL is structured, relates to the players ultimately as things to be traded finds reflection in such things as the continuously evolving scandal around player injuries and concussions. And despite what sometimes are very handsome packages of remuneration, the fact that the NFL ownership and administration suppressed the dissemination of the fact of these injuries, not just concussions, but all sorts of terrible things, for decades, reflects that they're acting out of an attitude which sees the players just as things. And who does the work? Who actually does the work? The players. They're the ones who play the games and provide the spectacle. Which actually is another point of connection with another thread of Marxist analysis provided by, chiefly but not exclusively by, a guy by the name of Adorno, who talked about the culture industry as an organ of mass deception, whereby you have, through a broad series of diversions, means whereby people can be distracted from appreciating the problematic aspects of social relationship within a capitalist framework by detaining them through entertainment. And the NFL is precisely an exponent of the culture industry. Almost a textbook case of what Adorno is discussing. So much for a few thoughts on how an appreciation of certain aspects of the Marxist tradition and the tools of analysis which it can provide can help us appreciate that facets of the NFL which are uncontroversially problematic can be understood as simply expressions of underlying problems with how our economy and our society is organized along lines which focus on profit and material acquisition to oftentimes the detriment of actual human well-being, human welfare. So I think that about sums it up for now. And hopefully it's good food for thought. And I guess I'll leave it there. Anyway, this has been Tom, and talking about Marxism and its possible relationship with certain facets of the National Football League. All right, guys, we'll have a lovely week, and I'll see you guys later.